Hello and welcome to the fifth session of Doubting Climate Change, the role of public relations in creating doubt about the science behind climate change. So today we're going to be looking at something called the Tobacco Playbook, which is in essence, it's a set of procedures that were followed by the tobacco companies in 1950s onwards that has become increasingly adopted by other industries, by other corporations as they've faced media scrutiny for their corporate practices, and you can see this particularly in various other industries, but primarily in the oil and gas extraction industries of today, when their impact on the world is being called into question. So I'll start with a little bit of a premise. So the premise is in our society that science helps keep us all safe and healthy. Evidence-based science, working on the research that's been done over previous generations, past generations, currently, helps to build a safe society, keep us all healthy. Governments and scientists have no interest in not keeping us safe and healthy. So this involves safeguards like keeping our drinking water clean and pure, making sure children's toys are safe, and they rely on evidence-based science and transparent policy making. And I appreciate the fact that there are some dubious practices that some industries adopt, but I don't want to go into that at this point because I'm talking about the fundamental premise on which science works. And scientific information helps inform choice about what we eat and what consumer products that we buy for our families from the array of products that are available to us. But we also rely on the fact that science informs the policymakers about what products are available to us within which we can choose what we consume. And evidence-based scientific information is based on repeatable independent experiments that consistently deliver similar outcomes. So the more science that is done around a particular question, the more reliable their outcomes. The larger the data set that the data is extracted from, the more reliable the outcome is. So the more certainty there is that what the scientific experiment has shown us is actually factual evidence. So we can adopt it with some degree of certainty. On tobacco, skipping back to World War I, which is 100 or so years ago, cigarette smoking was not that commonplace in the world, and cigarette production was largely based on rolling your own tobacco into a paper and making a cigarette that you could then smoke. So it was a complicated process, time-consuming process. In the 1880s, we'll talk about in the next slide the origins of it from the 1880s. But when World War I came around, governments determined that the soldiers in the fighting on our behalf, society's behalf, needed cigarettes as a way of dealing with the anxiety and the stress that they had in the trenches. So there's a quote here from research that was done in 1918 that says there are hundreds of thousands of men in trenches who would go mad or at least become so nervously inefficient as to be useless if tobacco was denied to them. So this was a scientific article that was supporting the use of tobacco within troops in warfare. But then the article went on to say that the argument that tobacco may shorten the life of 5 or 10 years, a lifespan of 5 or 10 years, and that it dulls the brain in the meantime, seems a little out of place in a trench where men stand in frozen blood and water and wait for death. So even back in 1918, there was a relationship. Science had this nascent understanding that there was something that was unhealthy about tobacco smoking, but it was a delayed process. It didn't impact straight away. And the immediate impact of the cigarette, of the nicotine and the chemicals that went into your body through smoking would have a calming effect on you. And that benefit outweighed the cost, if you will, of the long-term health problems that one was going to encounter because of smoking. And then in 1928, Leslie wrote, "The Great War, the First World War, maimed, killed, and devastated millions of people. But the worst thing it did was to entrench the cigarette into our habits, into our society, into our daily life." So back in 1928, people recognized this as a problem. So, but those who protested against cigarette smoking had their patriotism questioned, and the authorities stressed that tobacco was necessary for fighting soldiers to reduce the anxiety levels, etc. So during the First World War, the millions of soldiers who were fighting on both sides, and I'm using an illustration here from a Canadian advertising promotion campaign, but it was true on the German side and all of the people fighting, that cigarette smoking was used as a way of alleviating anxiety and tension amongst the troops fighting. So I talked a little bit about the industrialization of tobacco production. So up until around the 1880s, cigarettes were produced by hand. So there weren't many available, and it took time, if you were a smoker, it took time to stop doing what you're doing to roll the cigarette so that you could smoke it. So when you're in a war situation, that can't happen. So there was a need for prepackaged cigarettes. So there was in 1880, a machine was patented in the US to mass produce cigarettes in the form that we see them today, pre-rolled and coming in cartons. So that that was in the 1880s, and then there's a correlation between the introduction of that machine and the incidence of smoking. So the graph here shows that each year since or after the automated production of cigarettes, the number of cigarettes consumed in society increased dramatically. So there's a correlation there between industrialization and increased consumption. So skip forward to 1950s, because the number of cigarettes being consumed in the world was increasing. The amount of discussion about the impact of cigarette smoking on health was largely ignored. And if you look at a lot of advertisements around for cigarettes, there were a lot of medical professionals who were hired by the advertising industry to talk about which particular cigarettes created less health problems. And there was one for Camel where doctors were saying that Camel was better than other brands because it produced less coughing, because of the tobacco was toasted, as if that some way reduced the harm of it. But in 1950, two scientists in the UK, Doll and Hill, produced a paper that was published in the British Medical Journal that looked directly at the relationship, the causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer specifically. And one of the data sets that they worked on produced a graph like this that showed a real correlation in the increase in the incidence of cigarette smoking and the increase in incidence of lung cancer. So it was pointing towards, it wasn't saying definitely that there was a causal link, but it was pointing towards, or strongly pointing towards, a causal link between smoking and lung cancer. So this was published in 1950 in the British Medical Journal. It was a scientific journal, didn't have a large readership. But then in 1953, in December 1953, in the US, Reader's Digest, which was then the world's most read publication, it had a circulation of around 9 million copies in the US. They ran an article that was entitled "Cancer by the Carton." And this article, which was written for consumers in lay language, it wasn't a scientific article, but it was written in lay language, accessible to people with an average reading level, I guess. But it cited Doll and Hill's scientific findings. And with a readership of 9 million people, this rang alarm bells in the corridors of power of the tobacco industry. So the presidents of the four of the US largest tobacco companies, Philip Morris, Camels, whichever the British American Tobacco, met with a guy called John Hill. And John Hill was the founder of a public relations company called Hill & Knowlton. It was one of the larger public relations companies on Madison Avenue back in the 1950s. And it's continued to be a very large and powerful and influential public relations company through to today, where it still represents corporate interests from tobacco companies and gas and oil companies as well. So these the presidents, CEOs of these companies met with John Hill to determine what they can do, or what they could do, to push back against the Reader's Digest article. Interesting to note, they didn't do anything to push back against the research at that point. That had been in the wild for 3 years, but when this article was published, they realized that this was going to be read by average citizens, ordinary people, who were their target customer, and so they needed to do something about it. So in January 1954, they published something that's called a frank statement, and there's a copy of it here. If you Google a frank statement, you'll find the text and be able to read the whole thing in its entirety. The bit I'm concentrating on is what it's just highlighted in red at the moment. And they say in this frank statement that distinguished authorities, without saying who the distinguished authorities are, but these distinguished authorities point out that medical research in recent years indicates many possible causes of lung cancer. So the Dolan Hill article was saying there was a causal relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. The cigarette companies were saying there are many possible causes of lung cancer. Again, they're not citing who these distinguished authorities are. They went on to say there is no agreement amongst the authorities regarding what the cause is. Again, unnamed authorities and this notion of no agreement. They said there's no proof that cigarette smoking is one of the causes. Well, that's in direct contravention of what Dolan Hill was saying and the evidence that they were putting forward. They went on to say, point 4, statistics purporting to link cigarette smoking with the disease, lung cancer, could apply with equal force to any one of many other aspects of modern life, but there was no mention of what those other aspects could be. And there's no notion of what the statistics, these other aspects would yield. There's no data to support it. And then the final point is the validity of these statistics, the statistics produced by Dolan Hill themselves, is questioned by numerous scientists. And it's interesting that they don't name who those scientists are, but two, they're not scientists necessarily working in health, in lung disease, which is what Dolan Hill were working there. The lung specialists, their whole career was working with people with lung issues, lung disease. So this is the statement that was published. And what's interesting about this, the Frank statement was syndicated. It was published in 448 newspapers across the US, syndicated newspapers. And that had a total reach of 43 million people, which as a percentage of the population of the US was quite significant. But bear in mind, Reader's Digest reached 9 million people. So this is something that's 4 or 5 times more the population this statement is going to is 4 or 5 times more than the population that actually read the article that triggered the response. Excuse me. The Frank statement casts doubt on the science that links smoking with cancer. They did their best to undermine it without challenging it directly, but by putting in the public domain the notion that there were different interpretations available to the data, that there was discord amongst scientists working in the field, etc., etc. They, in the same statement, they pledged to create the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, and they said they would hire the best scientists to get to the truth. And this is a public statement they made, and so they did create the research committee, but the committee supported, almost without exception, projects which were not related directly to smoking and lung cancer. So they would investigate smoking, they would investigate lung cancer, but they didn't do any research linking the two. So it was a deliberate ploy to create new evidence, new science, that was going to go out into the public domain that had nothing to do with the article that they were trying to challenge and undermine. So the two things that they were trying to do here was obfuscation and diversion as their key strategy, as were the notion of the creation of alternative facts. So this is back in 1953. And their PR campaign, the strategy that was devised in the hotel was about a two-pronged PR campaign in order to get industry out of a hole and to stop public panic. Because the industry was in a hole, because their whole revenue system was built upon selling cigarettes to the public. And if the public thought that smoking would give them lung cancer, it would stop them buying problems, so that would be a problem for the industry itself. But if they can undermine the medical science around the causation, the causal link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, it would stop any public concern, any anxieties, any panic. And it was deliberately designed to do that. And they said there was only one real problem, which was to maintain confidence in the industry, how to establish it, how to maintain confidence in the industry that the product that was being sold to them wouldn't harm their health, wouldn't damage their health. So they came up with 5, 6 different strategies. So the first one that we'll look at very briefly here is the fake. So they conducted counterfeit science and tried to pass it off as legitimate research. So they would do experiments that were conducted in laboratories using animals, etc. But the purpose of the research wasn't to try to see if there was a causal link. It was looking into other things. But then they would claim that they were doing science into the subject in hand. So they would mimic, if you will, the science that was being done by people who were trying to challenge, trying to establish a causal link. They would imitate that, they would mimic it, but the core question they were trying to answer wasn't, does cigarette smoking cause lung cancer? They were trying to put other research questions in there and claim that it was trying to answer the same thing. So this was the creation, if you will, of alternate facts, which we've talked about in previous sessions, and how having a set of alternative facts that appear to be similar on the surface, but in reality are different because you're asking a different question. So this is the fake. The second was the blitz. And here what we've seen, and I mentioned this in the previous session, talking about Naomi Oreskes, when she published her article, a very short article on the human impact on climate change, and the way that she was sort of doorstepped by journalists, the way that she was harassed, the way that people tried to undermine her scientific and academic career. This is exactly a tactic that came from 1953, one of the strategies that Hill and Knowlton developed to try to discredit the science. So they would harass the scientists who speak out against the results, or views that are inconvenient with the industry. So anybody doing independent research that conformed to Doll and Hill's research became harassed. Their institutions were contacted to ask if there were any issues with the people politically. If you bear in mind, this was in the Cold War, so this notion of communism was present. So one of the ways of doing it was to suggest that people who were challenging good American corporations in what they were trying to do was because they were communists or they were sponsored by communists. So they were trying to undermine the public credibility of the scientists who were doing work that challenged the viability, the credibility of their industry. So this was just trying to discredit the science and the scientists. Then you have this notion of the diversion. So you'd manufacture uncertainty about the science where little or none exists. So I talked previously, and I mentioned Naomi Oreskes, where she did some research and meta-analysis that said that 97% of the world's climate scientists agreed that climate change was a result of man's human activities. And then the people working against climate, the oil and gas, the extraction industries, produce evidence that says something that's different. So this again is a tactic that came out of the 1953 meeting. So you create doubt, you manufacture uncertainty. So again, the tobacco companies created what they called a scientific research committee. It did a lot of research that wasn't around the main cause, but they also went into the articles that were being published. So people looked at Doll and Hill's article and they tried to find flaws in it. So they said, well, the statistical analysis isn't that good. It's only done with a 95% certainty rating as opposed to a 99% certainty rating. This kind of thing. So they were trying to nitpick, if you will, about the science that had been done because it didn't conform to what they wanted as the outcome. So then they created another tactic that was known as the screen, so they'd buy credibility through alliances with academia and with professional societies. So what this means is, in the tobacco industry, climate science deniers try to do the same thing now. So, and I'll use the example of Naomi Oreskes with her climate science papers. So she did a meta-analysis of papers that had been published by people whose whole career had been built around climatology, climate science. So what would happen is a gas or oil company would come to somebody like me, who's a social scientist. I have no hard science background in climatology. But I've got a PhD, so I'm called a doctor. So they'd come to me and they'd ask me my opinion on whether humans have an impact on climate change. And I'd say, well, maybe, maybe not. And I could write a nice article saying, in my opinion, I don't think it is. And then the oil and gas companies would publish that and say, look, there's conflicting evidence here. So by promoting people like me, who's not a climate scientist, to write something and to have an opinion about whether climate science is real or not, is looking at creating credibility around contrary positions. And they do that through academia, through funding research, funding schools, funding programs, and also through linkages with professional science societies whose primary work was not climate science. So this was another tactic to have this big smoke screen of evidence and facts in the public domain, so people couldn't determine which is credible and which is not credible unless you have a good solid scientific background and understanding. And the fifth one, is you manipulate government officials and processes, the creation of policy, to inappropriately influence the creation of policy. So here, this is where public relations can have a big impact through lobbying. And we talked a little bit about lobbying in previous sessions. And corporations, oil and gas corporations, have almost limitless amounts of money that they can spend trying to influence policy. So this goes on behind the scenes, but again, it's a way of dealing with the problem. And the tobacco companies were the first entities, corporations, to do this on a large-scale basis, and actually to document the process, which is why it's become known as the Tobacco Playbook. So this is lobbying, and it's as we would know it today. And I put here a slide saying the war against science continues, and it's the campaign to deny causality between cigarette smoking and lung cancer continues. The methods used by the corporations denying this causal link, you use exactly the same playbook, exactly the same techniques in denying the relationship between human activities and climate change. So this is why I'm saying here that the war against science continues, and it's conducted by corporate interests against public interest, if you will. So in 1968, an executive from Hill & Knowlton, the public relations company that created this playbook, told the industry magazine Tobacco and Health Research, and this is a magazine that was developed for the tobacco industry. So it's got a fancy title, Tobacco and Health Research. So if you just went by the title, you'd think that the tobacco industry is actually interested in research about human health. But he told this executive told the magazine in an interview that the most important stories that the magazine can publish cast doubt on the causal nature of smoking and lung disease. So what this points towards is the fact that the research committee wasn't actually interested in examining and exploring the causation. They're trying to deny it, basically. This is reinforced excuse me, by an internal member within British American Tobacco, where they said, and this is a very famous statement, doubt is our product, since it's the best way of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the public. It's also the means of establishing a controversy. So this is something that the senior executives at British American Tobacco were dealing with on a daily basis. They were trying to create doubt about the science behind the causal relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And the phrases that they use in their playbook were, there's no substantial evidence, there's no clinical evidence, an issue is unresolved, debate is unresolved, there's nothing statistically proven, there's nothing scientifically established, there's no scientific proof, etc., etc. So they came up with these stock phrases that they could issue in public statements when the corporation was challenged about the relationship between tobacco smoking and lung cancer. And what we see in subsequent areas where there's a concern, if you will, about corporations trying to deny causal relationships is exactly the same tactics, exactly the same strategic perspectives were adopted. So the tobacco industry laid down this playbook that can be pretty much picked up and taken by anybody to apply it to a cause or an issue where you're trying to defend the undefensible. So British American Tobacco's head of RD said a demand for scientific proof by an external party is always a formula for inaction and delay, and usually the first reaction of the guilty. So what they're saying is anytime somebody's asking you for real scientific evidence about the impact of your product or the science that you're doing around is the reaction of a guilty party. So you have to try to avoid this. And in 1970, Philip Morris's head of R&D wrote, "We're interested in evidence which we believe denies the allegations that cigarette smoking causes disease, i.e. alternative facts." This is in 1970, so 20 years after Doll and Hill's groundbreaking article that established the causal relationship. Philip Morris is still trying to deny it by following the playbook, by creating alternative facts, by denying the relationship. So we've talked about this being adopted by other corporate actors. So the corporate actors we're most interested in around climate change is oil and gas companies, extractive companies. And so the playbook's been adopted by many other actors, industries, to protect their destructive practices. Most recently, we see the strategies being adopted by companies that are trying to create doubt around the science, explaining climate change and the relationship between human activity and climate change. So there's a very clear adoption by these organizations of the same playbook that was developed in the 1950s. And the media are well aware of these tactics, but they don't challenge them, they play into them, they play along with them. And this is why one of the, if you will, the theses of this series is that the media is complicit in this, along with the public relations industry, in perpetuating this notion of doubt around the science, when the science is very clear and it's supported by the majority of the people working, independent researchers working in the field. And that leads me on to the final closing notion, if you will, around the impact of politics. And some notion here, an issue for independent scientific research nowadays is the ever diminishing resources of public funding for universities and research institutes. And as we see in Ontario, as we see across Canada and the United States and in Europe, increasingly governments are reducing the amount of funding that they're putting into universities. And so to maintain a similar level of research, these institutions need to find money from somewhere else. So increasingly they're turning to corporate partners. So what's happening here is academia is now being funded to some extent by corporations. And the research they're conducting is research that is driven by a corporate need. And that corporate need is to make a profit. So the notion of independent research, i.e. with academic freedom, a researcher, a scientist, a social scientist doing work that's interesting to them, irrespective of whether it has any tangible impact on society in that given moment, is disappearing. And that's really quite troubling, because publicly funded independent research, independent of corporations, independent of ideology, independent of political power, political party requirements, is absolutely vital in the pursuit of objective facts, which is the science that is based on keeping our society safe. So the graphic here, the final one of the slide, is of a skull smoking a cigarette. It's taken from the cover of a book called The Golden Holocaust, which is an in-depth academic analysis treatise on the relationship between the tobacco industry, public relations, and lung cancer. So I hope you're finding this series interesting. I look forward to next time we meet, and thank you for watching. And in the interim, if you want to go read something about what I'm talking about here and try to understand in greater detail the relationship between public relations, between mass media, between corporations funding their own research, independent think tanks that aren't independent, and independent science, then please go read and become better versed in it. So thank you.